I was born and raised as an American, and in part of that raising in school, I'm sure every nation has this, but you're taught a certain amount of national pride and the story and the history of your nation, and subtly you're led, persuaded, and it's considered, just cause that you're given a certain amount of patriotic loyalty to understand what makes your country the best and the superior one, and the story of its foundation and the purpose of its foundation, as presented, is intended to instill all that. And but as an adult, there's nothing wrong with looking out upon the other nations of the world and seeing good things about them and why that nation might also feel that they are the best nation in the world. Now, the narrative of competition that is considered patriotic and correct is to believe that the biggest detractors from this story that America is the best nation in the world are China and the Soviet Union. And we're taught that our biggest allies are Israel and Great Britain. But when it comes to matter of pride and patriotism, I'm not so sure that the British and Israelis agree that America is the best nation in the world and the one that serves as the conqueror, the winner, the current reigning champ. So with all that, I'm going to focus on the history of one nation in particular. It's not going to be Great Britain because America's extension of Great Britain in its foundation, but yet that involved a war between the two, and so it makes sense that there'd be a dispute there between the two overall, but yet a certain amount of fondness as well, being as there is also that connection. So, but I'm going to focus on the other one of our allied nations, and that's Israel. And it has one of, if not the most remarkable story of how it came to be a nation. Now, our story begins with a man named Jacob, who one night God entered into his camp and started a wrestling match with him. And the two, Jacob and God, wrestled all night long until ultimately Jacob was given a new name by God, and that name was Israel. And there's other people in history and who've had that occurrence happen to them where something was so profound, there was the before and the after, and that after person that they were after the event was so different from what they were before the event that a new name was needed. So Israel was one of those people, and from henceforth unto all generations thus far, Israel has kept that name. Now, Israel had 12 sons by 3 different brides. But I believe it's 3. I don't know. We'll get to that point later. And maid servants of the brides. 12 sons in total. And one of the sons' name was Joseph. Joseph was out with his brothers one day, and they conspired against him. And he was sold unto the Egyptians. And he went away with the Egyptians, and Israel was told by his sons that a lion had come and killed him. Or some large animal had come and killed him. And they used sheep blood on a rag to be like, look, see? That's his blood. So off Joseph was taken. Then it came to be, in Egypt, Joseph had the ability to see the future. He was able to see it in dreams, not his own dreams, other people's dreams, when revealed to them, told him what the future would bring. So There Joseph began to tell the future, and it took him all the way up to the top when he predicted a period of drought was going to come unto the land of Egypt. And because of Joseph, Egypt prepared for the famine associated with the drought and stored up a great amount of food. Meanwhile, Israel and his remaining sons and his wives and their maidservants and all their flocks faced the famine and the drought. And because they heard that there was wealth in the land of Egypt that could possibly sustain them, Israel sent sons to Egypt to be barter out a trade to obtain what was needed for their survival. Well, who did they ultimately end up coming to, who is now considered a man of the leaders, among the leaders, was their own brother, Joseph. And ultimately, the family was reunited in Egypt, Israel and all his sons, and Joseph. And what a remarkable story that was. But as generations went on, after Israel had passed away, and he told his sons the way he wanted how his inheritance would be carried out on earth amongst them, and Joseph getting a double portion, Joseph's descendants of his Egyptian wife, who was of the priesthood of Egypt, would be given a double portion from Israel. And that generation passed away, and 400 years went by, and the Egyptians, as they saw the Israelites, began to multiply and show difference in their appearance. Their fondness of them that began with Joseph was now becoming envy. And because of envy, they began to hoist extra burdens upon them and weight them down with the burdens. And they had become, after 400 years, slaves, a lower class system. But yet, in that lower class system, they began to be mighty and strong. Until ultimately it was Moses who was chosen from their providence above, that they would be led out of Egypt. Now Moses was raised by Egyptians, but he saw the mistreatment of his people, and he was chosen, sparing the details, after a case of manslaughter against one of the slave drivers that he saw abusing one of his own brethren. That's when Moses broke ranks with the Egyptians and took upon himself the burden of freeing these people that he was a part of, but had not had to live as part of them. And he began to be told by God what he needed to do, and he went to the Pharaoh and told the Pharaoh, and it ultimately leads to Moses leading the descendants of Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness. But he was not leading them alone. He was given a fire by night to follow that came down from the sky and showed him the way to go. And he was given a pillar of cloud by day, which he followed, and it showed him the way out of the land of Egypt. And in course of this, following this descension from the sky upon the earth that was showing them the way, that same providence from above parted the Red Sea, and they crossed. And there they were led ultimately to the promised land, where Moses was able to look out on it, but was not able to enter into it. During the course of that time in the wilderness before Moses passed away, Moses was given the 10 Commandments that were written by God himself when he went upon a mountaintop up to converse with that power from the sky that it was able to rain down both fire and a pillar of smoke, and was given these commandments on stone, and then ultimately they were put in an ark, and they were carried in this ark and into battle after Moses was gone. And there with that ark, with these commandments inside, the covenant it carried brought them strength and helped them take the land that would be known as the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and the inheritance of the children of Israel. Now many generations passed, and Babylonians and other Romans and other conquerors descended upon Israel and battled against them, trying to take that land. And eventually that land was taken away from them to a large degree, but yet some of them still maintain their homeland there in their own form, sometimes as a higher class and sometimes as a lower class. But millenniums passed. Now mind you, the beginning of this story was about 4,500 years ago when Jacob became Israel. And all these 4.5 millenniums went by, and in Germany these people became persecuted, and they were battled against by the Nazis. And then a war was fought, and they were given a land. They were given back that initial land that was inherited to them ultimately as a result of all this. And mind you, this story, all that I've told you, is legally true. That means that legally it is considered factual in its inception, in its middle, and the fact that it is the proof that it is considered legally true is the fact that this nation is still named Israel today. And the fact that the 12 children who were descendants of Israel is considered factual is by the fact that these people are considered legally a race. And that means that legally their bloodlines trace back to this one man, Israel. And part of these considerations of fact is that they're given protection of racism in America, that to speak out against them is an act of racism. And to speak out against their belief in this story is considered an attack upon religion, because they are not only considered a nation, a race, but also a religion under Judaism, which tells that they were chosen by God to be led through the nations and given this promised land. And so that is an amazing story. Now, if you ask me if it's true, my honest opinion, yes, it is. I believe that it is 100% true. I believe that they do descend back to this man named Israel. And I do believe their account, because if one thing can be said about the Jewish people, it is the fact that they have kept preserved their story better than any other nation I know. And that is what makes them, to this day, be able to exist as a nation, because they did. And why do I believe that they were chosen by God? Yes, I even believe that. And I believe that the reason they were chosen was because they kept an accurate story. They kept their story, and they kept the story for others as well. Because not only do they provide us with the story of their history of their own nation, but their account goes back farther than that, to their father, the father of Israel, whose name was Isaac, and the father of Isaac, whose name was Abraham. And the Abraham story is kept also by the Muslims. And in this descendants, we are taught that the Muslims and Israelites were once brethren. And other nations as well, all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in that original account, we are told that all men are brethren. So therefore, I think it's a wonderful story, and I'm glad that we have what the Israelites have gave us. And that is the story of the people and the nation of Israel.